What would you do if your own father left you to die in the middle of the desert, with nothing but a broken leg and a cracked water jug? No note, no goodbye, just sand silence and the certain promise of death. But this isn't a story about endings. It's about a woman who turned that silence into strength, and what she gave birth to will leave you speechless. Stay with us, because once you hear how this ends, you'll never forget it. They said she was too old for dreams, too broken to matter, and too invisible to be missed. But what if I told you that the woman left for dead under a Joshua tree would one day cradle a life that changed everything? Not just her own, but the very soul of the land that tried to bury her. Evelyn Monroe had survived hardship before, but nothing quite like this. The moment her father walked away without a word or backward glance, the Mojave became her executioner. He didn't leave with rage or finality, just the indifference of a man who no longer believed his daughter was worth the trouble. He dropped her small canvas sack, a half-filled canteen, and a worn wool blanket onto the dust, then turned and mounted his horse. That was it. No goodbye, no reason, no mercy. The heat pressed down like judgment. The sand burned beneath her palms as she tried to sit upright. Her right leg, twisted and bruised from a fall days earlier, refused to support her. The wind kicked dust into her mouth as if trying to choke the last of her resistance. Above her, the sky stretched wide and empty, a blue so harsh it mocked her pain. She didn't scream. Screaming was for those who believed rescue might come. Evelyn knew better. It had started with chores. It always did. Her father, Everett Monroe, never asked. He commanded, and when Evelyn hesitated when she asked for a moment to rest her swollen ankle, the same one she'd hurt herding goats, he stared down at her like a stranger. "You think life cares," he'd muttered. That afternoon he loaded up his wagon. She thought they were heading to town. They ended up 20 miles beyond the last outpost, past the dunes and the ghost mines. Somewhere between nowhere and gone. That's where he left her. The Mojave is not silent. It hums, it seethes, it listens. The desert doesn't forget a scream. It carves pain into stone and sand alike. Evelyn lay back, letting her breath settle, watching a raven drift across the sun's path. The pain in her leg throbbed like an alarm she couldn't silence, but her mind, a mind once full of poems and faraway stories, fought to stay awake. She had not cried when her mother died 5 winters earlier, had not cried when Everett, broken by grief and pride, began to drink more than he spoke, had not cried when she lost the chance at marriage, too strange, the town said, too old, too quiet. But now, alone, with the vultures circling and the sun baking her skin, Evelyn wanted to cry for the first time, not because she feared death, because she feared her story would end without being told. Somewhere in her mind, her mother's voice returned, not clearly, but as a whisper stitched into memory. "You are not your father's silence. You are not the land that left you." That whisper kept her awake through the first night. Coyotes howled from the distance. The wind picked up dry and hot, like the breath of something ancient and watching. She wrapped herself in the coarse blanket, every movement sending a jolt through her damaged leg. Sleep came in fragments, flashes of fever, dreams of shadowed cliffs and a cabin she couldn't reach. By morning, her lips cracked. Her water was nearly gone. She watched an ant crawl across her hand, determined, aimless. She wondered if that's what she had become, something small, lost, surviving without purpose. The second day brought sun without forgiveness. The kind of heat that warps time. Her thoughts grew hazy. She remembered birthdays that were never celebrated. The weight of her father's words. The way he once said, "Dreams are for the weak." But what if he was wrong? That thought, tiny and defiant, sparked somewhere deep inside. The desert hadn't claimed her yet. It had tested her. There was a difference. Maybe she was still meant to endure. And then she heard it. A bark, distant, high-pitched echoing off stone. Evelyn squinted. At first, she thought it was the heat, the kind of mirage her mind might conjure before shutting down for good. But then came the hoofbeats, steady, rhythmic, breaking through the stillness like a promise. She turned her head toward the sound, every muscle screaming in protest. Across the sand, cutting through the rippling haze, came a silhouette. A horse, tall and brown. A rider with a wide-brimmed hat and slow, careful movements. And bounding ahead of them a dog, golden, with sharp eyes and a tongue lolling out of its mouth like it was laughing at the heat. The rider dismounted. The dog, Rosie she'd learn later, sniffed her cheek and let out a small whine. "Oh, God," the man murmured. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't heroic, but it was real. It was human, and in that moment that was everything. He knelt beside her, hands weathered and kind. He didn't flinch at her condition. He didn't ask stupid questions like, "What happened?" or "Why are you here?" He opened a canteen and lifted it to her lips. The water was warm and metallic. It tasted like life. "My name's Micah," he said, brushing wind-blown hair from her face. "You're safe now. Safe." A word she hadn't heard in years. She couldn't speak. Her throat was raw, but her eyes held on to his, searching for any sign that this was real. He seemed to understand. He wrapped the blanket tighter around her, then lifted her gently as though she might break. He carried her to his horse, whispering reassurances not to her, but to the air, the ground, the dog, as if everything around them needed to believe it too. She drifted in and out of consciousness as they rode. She remembered his humming, low, tuneless, steady. She remembered Rosie's fur brushing her hand. She remembered the sky darkening behind them and the feel of his arms not letting go. By the time they reached the cabin, tucked deep in a fold of hills that held shadows like secrets, Evelyn had almost convinced herself it was another dream. But the scent of cedar told her otherwise. This was not the end. It was the beginning of something she could not yet name. And the desert, which had almost buried her, would now have to witness what came next. The first thing Evelyn noticed was the silence, not the silence of death, but of safety. It wasn't the suffocating stillness of the desert, nor the bone-deep hush of abandonment. This silence was soft living wrapped in the scent of boiling sage, and the distant creak of old pine boards beneath slow footsteps. It came with warmth, real warmth, not the brutal sun that had tried to take her, but the kind that settled over the skin like a wool shawl passed down through generations. She blinked against the soft morning light seeping through the window lace curtains, fluttering with a breeze that smelled of cedar smoke and juniper. Her leg throbbed beneath the quilt wrapped in clean bandages. A cup sat near the edge of a table, steaming gently. And curled beside her, half dozing, was the golden dog from the desert. For a moment, she wondered if she had died. If this was heaven, it was humbler than she imagined. But no, there were the sharp notes of pain in her ribs, the dry tightness in her throat, the feel of her body reminding her it still had battles left to fight. Micah moved like a ghost at first. He didn't rush toward her or ask questions. He simply appeared in the doorway holding a bowl of broth and a spoon carved from wood. His eyes were deep-set quiet. His beard was neatly trimmed, and the flannel shirt he wore bore signs of long use and careful mending. He looked like a man who had once lived loudly, and had since learned the value of soft spaces. "You're awake," he said, as though stating it to the air rather than to her. "That's good." Evelyn tried to speak, but her voice snagged on dryness. He set down the bowl and lifted a cup instead, helping her sip. The tea was earthy with a trace of mint and bark. "You've been asleep 2 nights," he said. "The fever broke yesterday." The dog, Rosie, lifted her head and thumped her tail. Micah rubbed behind her ears and added, "She didn't leave your side." Evelyn didn't know what to say. She didn't know if she wanted to speak at all. Words had been used like weapons for so long in her life that silence felt safer. Micah seemed to understand. He never pushed, never asked. Each day brought small changes. She learned the pattern of the cabin, the sound of the kettle just before it boiled, the way Rosie scratched at the door, before a sunrise the scent of pine resin when Micah chopped kindling. He wasn't much for talk, but everything he did felt like a conversation. He moved with quiet purpose. He cooked, he cleaned, he tended the herbs drying in bundles above the fireplace. The walls of the cabin were covered in stories, though none told aloud. Wooden tools, hand-carved spoons, chipped mugs with carefully etched handles. Everything had the feel of having been touched more than once, valued not for beauty, but for the comfort they offered. She spoke for the first time on the 6th morning. Her voice came like a creak in an old floorboard, unused, fragile. "Evelyn." Micah looked up from his workbench. He nodded, not startled, not intrusive. That's a strong name. She nodded, then rested. Later that afternoon he handed her a cup of stronger tea and sat in the old rocking chair near the hearth. Rosie lay at his feet and the fire crackled with steady warmth. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice stronger now but still coated in doubt. He rubbed his palms together and stared into the fire before answering. "Because someone once helped me, and I didn't deserve it either." There was no drama in his words, no performance, just a fact he was willing to share. In the days that followed, Evelyn began to move first from the bed to the chair, then to the porch where a bench overlooked a patch of earth that could have once been a garden. Micah brought her a blanket each time and left a tin cup filled with water or broth nearby. When she asked for something to do, he showed her how to snip dried lavender for tea, then how to steep the roots of yarrow and willow bark. When she asked about his work, he handed her a block of wood and a carving knife. She had never carved before. She expected mockery. He only said, "Start with a spoon. It teaches patience." Micah, she learned, had built the cabin with his own hands, left Flagstaff after losing his sister to typhoid and his fiancée to something more complicated, grief maybe. A grief that made him wander until the land told him to stop. And when it did, he listened. Evelyn listened too. She listened to the rhythm of wind against the windows, the scratch of pen against paper when she finally asked for one. She began to sketch again, not people, not yet, but trees. Rosie curled in a basket, Micah leaning over his workbench with the golden afternoon light falling across his shoulders. One morning, she found a stick beside her bed, polished, smooth-shaped with care, and etched near the handle with a single juniper bloom. Micah didn't say anything, just nodded toward it. She held it, and for the first time in weeks she cried, quietly, without shame, because it wasn't just a walking stick. It was proof that someone had seen her not as broken, but as becoming. Healing, she learned, doesn't come in grand declarations or loud transformations. It comes in boiled herbs and a cup already waiting when you wake. It comes in unasked-for kindness and a chair that rocks gently beside yours on cold mornings. The desert had tried to erase her, but in this small cabin beneath the juniper sky, Evelyn was slowly being rewritten. Not saved, remembered. And maybe that was the beginning of something holy. Evelyn never planned on speaking to her past. She believed she had buried it under too many years of silence, too many bruises that didn't show. But pain has a way of leaving breadcrumbs. And sometimes it circles back not to punish but to test if you're still afraid. The morning began with the gentle hush of snowflakes against the cabin window. Rosie lay curled at Evelyn's feet, her breath rising and falling with peaceful rhythm. Micah was already outside splitting firewood, each strike a steady beat against the hush of winter. That rhythm, simple and sure, had become the heartbeat of Evelyn's healing. It was how she measured the return of time of life of herself. That day was quiet, not empty, not eerie, the kind of quiet that feels earned, not imposed. Evelyn had made it to the porch on her own that morning, using the walking stick Micah had carved for her. Her knee still ached when the cold crept in, but the pain no longer frightened her. She had grown used to listening to her body rather than fearing it. She sat on the bench, wrapped in a thick shawl sketchbook in hand. The drawing was of Rosie, nose to the earth tail, curled like a question mark. She smiled. It felt good to smile without the ache of guilt behind it. Then the knock came. It wasn't just loud, it was purposeful, sharp, a sound not asking for permission but demanding entry. Rosie growled low. Micah paused mid-swing and looked toward the path. Evelyn felt something inside her go still. Her fingers tightened around her pencil. Some memories don't fade. They hide in the corners of your soul, waiting for footsteps that sound too familiar. Micah opened the door slowly, and there he was. Evelyn Monroe, the man who had abandoned her, who had left her in the Mojave with a cracked canteen and a broken leg. Time had not changed him. It had deepened his edges, made his eyes colder. He didn't wear regret. He wore resentment. "So, this is where you've been," he said. He stepped inside uninvited. The wind followed him briefly like a ghost. Micah stood between them, steady but silent. Rosie stayed at Evelyn's side, unmoving. "You've made yourself real comfortable," Everett said, glancing around the room. "Living off a stranger. Living off pity." Evelyn's heart beat louder, but her voice remained quiet. "I'm living," she said simply. Everett frowned. "I came to bring you back, where you belong." Evelyn stood slowly walking stick firm beneath her grip. The pain in her knee sparked, but she kept her gaze locked on him. "I don't belong with someone who left me to die. You're my daughter." "No," she said. "I'm Evelyn. That's what I belong to now." He laughed a short, humorless sound. "You think this is real? You think he'll stay when things get hard, when winter stretches too long, when food runs low?" Micah stepped closer now. Calm, protective. That's enough. But Evelyn raised her hand slightly, stopping him. "I used to believe every word you ever said," she told her father. "That I was weak. That dreaming made me useless. That kindness was a liability, and I tried for years to be what you needed." Her voice shook, but only once. Then it steadied, as if her own truth was rising to hold her upright. "But you didn't need me," she continued. "You needed someone to carry your shame. I won't do that anymore." Everett opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Evelyn walked to the hearth, pulled a folded page from the drawer, and held it out. It was a drawing of the house she grew up in. Cold, lifeless. A cracked chimney and a crooked fence. "No light in the windows? That's what I remember," she said. "That's what I escaped." He stared at it, and then just as wordlessly dropped it to the floor. "You'll regret this," he whispered. "When this land turns against you." "Maybe," she said, "but it's my land now." He turned to leave, but paused at the door, as if something else might follow. But nothing did, only silence. And then the creak of boots fading down the path. The door closed behind him. Gently, not slammed, just done. Micah stepped beside her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. She nodded. "But I did." That night they sat quietly. The fire crackled low. Rosie's head rested on Evelyn's knee. Micah's hand found hers and they didn't speak for a long time. The silence didn't feel like before. It wasn't absence. It was presence. A space that held all she had survived. She looked at the walking stick, traced the grooves Micah had carved, marks of care, of intention, of time. She realized then that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about remembering differently. Her father's words no longer held weight. Her silence no longer meant surrender. Sometimes finding your voice isn't loud. It's in standing when your legs still shake. It's in facing the one who called you nothing and saying, "I'm still here." That night, Evelyn slept without fear. And when she woke, she felt something she hadn't in years. Freedom. And she knew that her voice, once buried, now had roots, and nothing, not even winter, could pull it out again. No one tells you that hope sometimes arrives in silence, that it grows in the stillness between moments, between healing and heartbreak, between survival and surrender. For Evelyn, it came not in fireworks or revelation, but in a lingering ache behind her eyes and the sudden, unshakable sense that something inside her had changed. At first, she didn't dare believe it. Not after everything she'd been through, not after the desert, not after her father's return. Her life had been shaped by endings, not beginnings. And yet every morning she woke with a quiet sense of expectancy, like something within her was trying to speak. She said nothing for days. She moved through her new life with Micah with care, tending the herbs, sketching, mending, helping him in the garden when her knee allowed. But beneath the routine, a question grew louder. What if? The morning she walked into town, snow still clung to the branches. It was a long journey from the cabin to the village, but she needed answers only one person could give. Behind the general store, tucked between rows of old crates and climbing ivy, lived Miriam, a midwife with more years of wisdom than most doctors, and a gaze that saw far beyond flesh. Miriam didn't need Evelyn to speak. She looked once at her face and said gently, "Come inside." The test was quiet. A cup of tea was placed in Evelyn's hands before the results were spoken. Miriam sat across from her, palms folded over Evelyn's trembling ones. "You're going to be a mother," she said. "And from what I know of you, you'll be a good one." Evelyn didn't answer at first. Her breath caught in her throat. All the words she had stored inside, words of doubt, of disbelief, of impossible miracles, they dissolved into tears. "I was told I couldn't have children," she whispered. Miriam only smiled. Some things don't ask for permission. They simply arrive. The walk back to the cabin was slow, not because of fatigue, but because Evelyn needed the time. She touched her stomach through her coat, her fingers trembling. A child, life, growing where so much had been broken. Micah was at the hearth when she returned. He looked up as she entered, and something in her face must have told him everything. He didn't speak, just walked toward her and waited. She took his hand and said it simply, "We're going to have a child." His eyes widened, not with fear but wonder. He lowered his forehead to hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. In the days that followed, the cabin began to change. Slowly, gently. Micah carved a cradle from pine, sanding it, smooth, adding tiny carvings of stars and rivers and oak leaves. Evelyn began painting the walls of what would be the nursery, soft flowers, winding vines, sky-colored swirls that curled up toward the rafters. She kept sketching, but now the pages were filled with new subjects, an imagined child, the curves of a cheek, the outline of Micah holding a small hand. Rosie began sleeping closer to her belly, as though she too knew something new was coming. They named her before she arrived. Grace. Not because life had been easy, not because they had earned joy, but because everything they had, every breath, every beat of this new life felt unmerited, undeserved, and holy. Neighbors began to come by more often. Some brought herbs, Others brought stories. They sat on the porch with Evelyn sipping tea, sharing memories. They had heard whispers of her survival, of her stand against her father. But more than that, they came to feel what the cabin now held: peace, possibility, and something they couldn't quite name. Micah opened the workshop to local boys, showing them how to carve, to build, to mend. Evelyn opened her sketchbooks to children, letting them draw in the margins, teaching them how to hold a pencil and listen to the shapes inside their minds. One day, an elderly couple came bearing a bundle of soft wool. "We heard," they said, "about the baby. We had extra." Another left a single wooden toy on the step. No note, just love. As Evelyn's belly grew, so did the rhythm of the home. The fire crackled each night as Micah read old books aloud, poems about storms and sunlight. Evelyn stitched tiny clothes beneath the lamplight, sometimes humming the songs her mother used to sing. She remembered the Mojave then, not with fear, but with reverence. She remembered lying beneath that Joshua tree, broken and alone. She remembered thinking it was the end, but it had only been the beginning. Now, as spring approached, she began to feel her daughter's movements, small flutters at first, then stronger kicks. Each one reminded her of her own strength, of what it meant to carry life inside a body once left for dead. One night, curled beside the fire, she turned to Micah and whispered, "I was so sure I was meant to be alone." He looked at her eyes full of light. "You weren't. You were just meant to find the right place to begin again." She smiled and laid her hand on her belly. "Then she's not just our daughter. She's proof that something good can grow in broken ground." And as the night wrapped around them, Evelyn realized that the grace she had named her child after it had already begun to bloom. Not in some distant, perfect future, but here, now. In the home they had built, in the life they had chosen, and in the child that now waited quietly to be born. And the desert, which had once tried to bury her, would now have to witness the greatest miracle of all. She was no longer just surviving. She was beginning again. They say the sky is endless, but Evelyn knew better. She had seen its edges once, where the stars refused to shine and the wind whispered of endings. But now, as she stood on the porch of the cabin that had become a sanctuary, arms wrapped around her newborn daughter, she realized something deeper. The sky wasn't endless, it was held by places like this, by people like her and Micah, by memories that refused to die and by hope that refused to be silenced. They named their home Skyhold not as a boast, but as a truth, because this place built by calloused hands and quiet love had become something bigger than shelter. It had become sacred ground, not because of any ceremony, but because of what it had seen, what it had survived, and most importantly, what it had allowed to begin. Grace was born in the middle of a summer storm. The sky had cracked open with thunder and wild rain, as if the heavens themselves were bearing witness to her arrival. Evelyn labored through the night. Micah beside her eyes, steady voice, calm. Miriam, the midwife, whispered encouragements, her hands moving with practiced wisdom. And when the cry finally came, a full, healthy, defiant sound, Evelyn wept not from pain, but from reverence. Grace was small, but her presence was vast. She fit perfectly into the cradle Micah had carved, her fingers curling around the edge as if claiming it. Rosie never left her side, and Evelyn often woke in the early hours to see the dog watching the crib with the vigilance of a guardian angel. Life unfolded in gentle rhythms after that. Mornings began with the sound of the stove crackling, Micah humming softly as he prepared tea. Evelyn would cradle Grace, walking barefoot through the dew-kissed grass, whispering lullabies passed down from her mother. The land around them bloomed lavender sage marigold, all planted by Evelyn's hands. It was not a farm. It was a healing place. Children came to draw with her seated in the dirt with sketchbooks and wild imagination. She taught them not just lines and shading, but how to see. To notice the way light moves across a leaf. To feel the soul of a story in a single color. Micah, meanwhile, welcomed boys who had lost fathers, or who had fathers but no guidance. He handed them chisels and wood and taught them how to build something that would last. It's not about making it perfect, he'd say. It's about making it yours. Neighbors began referring to the cabin simply as Skyhold. It wasn't on any map, but people found it. Broken people, lost people, curious people, and each left lighter. Not because of miracles, but because Evelyn and Micah gave them space to remember who they were beneath the noise. One afternoon, a woman from town brought her teenage son. He hasn't spoken in months, she said. Evelyn handed him a pencil. Micah handed him a plank. By sunset, the boy had drawn the cabin rough and simple, but unmistakably real. Evenings at Skyhold were slow. Fires crackled. Tea steamed. Grace would coo in her crib while Micah read aloud from books Evelyn once thought too heavy to carry. She sewed by the firelight sometimes, just listening to the wind. And every now and then she would step outside alone, look up at the stars and say, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular. Just to the sky. To the world. To whatever had kept her alive when she should have died. The desert never quite left her. Sometimes in her dreams she still saw the red dust, still heard the silence, still felt the ache in her broken leg. But those memories didn't haunt her now, they humbled her, because without that pain she would have never found this peace. Grace grew quickly. She was curious, strong-willed, and full of questions. "Why do clouds move?" she once asked at 2 years old. "Where do birds sleep?" Evelyn never tired of answering. She never tired of watching Micah scoop her up, showing her how to sand wood, how to tie knots, how to hold the world gently in her hands. They made new traditions. Saturday mornings meant cinnamon bread and music. Summer nights meant chasing fireflies barefoot in the field. Winter brought long days by the fire building puzzles, reading stories, and watching the snow turn the world soft. But it wasn't all ease. Evelyn still had hard days. Days when her body ached or when sadness brushed her chest like an old ghost. But those days didn't define her. They reminded her that healing was not forgetting. It was remembering without breaking. One spring morning, Micah built a new bench beneath the oldest juniper tree. They carved their names into the side, and beside them the name Grace. So she always knows, Micah said, where she came from. Years passed, but Skyhold never lost its warmth. It became known as the house that healed, the house that held the sky. Not because it was grand, but because it made room for people to breathe. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and Grace ran through the wildflowers chasing something only children can see, Evelyn turned to Micah and said, "Do you ever wonder how our story ends?" He smiled and pulled her close. "No," he said, "because I think we're still at the beginning." She leaned her head on his shoulder and watched the sky turn lavender. The house behind them stood steady, its walls soaked with stories, its floors smoothed by bare feet, its windows glowing with the kind of light that only love can make. And Evelyn, once a girl left to die beneath a tree, now stood where the sky touched the earth and called it home. Not because she was saved by a miracle, but because she chose to believe in one. And that belief, like the child she named Grace, changed everything. Evelyn Monroe's journey is more than a story of survival. It is a story about choosing life in the face of abandonment, about finding beauty in the middle of brokenness, and about discovering grace not in grand moments, but in the quiet persistence of the human heart. It's a story of a woman who had every reason to give up and didn't. A story that reminds us that even when we are left with nothing but pain, silence, and scorched earth, there can still be something more waiting just beyond the next breath. When Evelyn was left to die in the Mojave Desert, no one, not even she, expected her to survive. The desert was vast, merciless, and absolute. Her father had written her off, left her behind without a second glance. She had no water, a broken leg, and a heart full of years of neglect. And yet she endured. Not because someone saved her right away, but because something inside her refused to let go. A whisper, a memory, a belief that maybe, just maybe, her story didn't have to end like this. And then Micah came. Not a hero in shining armor, but a man with calloused hands and a dog named Rosie. He didn't rush her healing. He didn't force her to open up. He simply made space for her wounds, her silence, her strength. In the quiet of that cabin, Evelyn rediscovered something she had almost lost the courage to be seen. Micah showed her that love wasn't loud or demanding. It was steady. It was patient. It was presence. She learned to speak again, not with grand speeches, but with sketches, questions, and the simple act of staying. She taught herself how to walk, how to carve, how to trust her own hands to create. In a world that had told her she was weak, she began to build. When her father returned, trying to reclaim her, Evelyn stood not as the frightened girl he once knew, but as the woman she had become. Her voice didn't tremble. She didn't beg. She simply said the truth she was not his to discard anymore. That moment wasn't just about defiance. It was about ownership of her voice, her worth, her future. And then came the miracle. Grace. A child that wasn't supposed to exist. A pregnancy that defied expectation and logic. Grace wasn't born from certainty, she was born from faith. From the soil of suffering, from love that had no conditions. Evelyn carried her not only with her body, but with her entire being. And when Grace entered the world, it was as if the whole desert exhaled. Something new had bloomed. Skyhold, the cabin they called home, became more than a shelter. It became a sanctuary, a place where broken things were not discarded, but gently made whole. A place where children learned to draw, and boys learned to build. Where sorrow had a seat at the table right beside joy. Evelyn and Micah didn't preach. They didn't try to fix anyone. They simply lived their truth out loud, and in doing so they gave others permission to do the same. Skyhold became a legend not because of its size or wealth, but because of its heart. Because of the grace that filled its halls. As Grace grew, she absorbed that grace. She asked questions. She built with her hands. She learned not to fear mistakes, but to learn from them. Evelyn watched her daughter and saw not just a child, but a legacy, a reminder that the past doesn't define us. Our choices do. So what do we take from Evelyn's story? What can we carry with us? First, your beginning doesn't define your ending. You can be left behind and still find a way forward. Pain is real, but it's not final. Second, true love may come softly. It may not sweep in with grand gestures. It may arrive as a man who listens more than he speaks, a dog who curls beside your bed, or a hand-carved stick left by your door. Recognize it. Honor it. Third, healing is not a straight line. There will be days you still ache. Days the past knocks again. But healing means standing anyway, speaking anyway, planting seeds even when you're unsure they'll grow. And lastly, grace is everywhere. In the way the light touches your face in the morning. In the way someone sits beside you when you feel alone. In the voice that says, I believe in you, even when you can't believe in yourself. Let Evelyn's story remind you of your own. Maybe your desert isn't Mojave. Maybe your wounds are invisible. But still there is hope. Still there is time. Still, your story is not over. If Evelyn could rise from dust, so can you. And if this story touched you, if it stirred something in your spirit, please support our channel. Subscribe. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Help us bring more stories like Evelyn's into the light. Because someone out there is waiting, not for advice, not for rescue, but for a story that makes them believe again. Skyhold was built from silence, sorrow, and second chances. And now it holds the sky. Thank you for being here. We hope you'll stay for what comes next.